The eviction notice on the door of our old apartment wasn't white. It was a fluorescent, aggressive orange, the color of road flares and emergency vests. I didn't rip it down. I taped it to the inside of my notebook, right next to the receipt for the box cutter and the heavy-duty trash bags. 14 days. That was the precise blast radius of my life. If I didn't stabilize our coordinates within 336 hours, Zoe would be sleeping in the back of the Honda Civic, and the state would start asking questions I couldn't afford to answer. We stood on the porch of the new place, the estate, the listing had called it, which was real estate code for a structural failure waiting to happen. The wood under my boots felt spongy, like wet cardboard. It smelled of salt damp and neglected cedar. Zoe looked up at me, her small hand gripping the strap of her backpack until her knuckles turned white. She didn't ask if it was safe. She didn't ask if there were ghosts. She asked the only question a 7-year-old in our tax bracket learns to prioritize: how long this time? "Mama, long enough," I said. It was a lie, but it was a functional one. I unlocked the front door. The hinges screamed, metal grinding on rusted metal, a sound that vibrated in my teeth. We stepped inside. My photographer's eye automatically started dissecting the space, ignoring the emotional weight and focusing on the physics of light. The afternoon sun cut through the grime on the windows in thick, solid beams, illuminating a universe of dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. The architecture was mid-century modern, beautiful bones wrapped in rot. I saw the potential immediately, the way the shadows fell across the sunken living room, the lines of the fireplace that had been choked by soot. But potential doesn't pay the heating bill. I did the math as I walked the perimeter. Roof repairs, 10,000. Plumbing, 5. Electrical, a nightmare I didn't even want to quantify. I had $11,000 left in the world, and I had just spent every cent of it to buy this wreck. The bank had offloaded it in a quiet courthouse auction, the kind of listing you win when nobody with options is bidding. It wasn't an investment. It was a bunker. I needed a perimeter Zoe could sleep inside, while I figured out how to survive. I checked the windows. Latched. I checked the back door. The lock was loose. The wood frame splintered. I made a mental note. Secure first. Clean second. I left Zoe in the living room with her tablet and a bag of pretzels, the universal pacifier of the working poor, and moved to the master bedroom. This was where we would sleep. It was smaller than the photos suggested, the walls covered in peeling wallpaper that looked like dead skin. There was a built-in closet along the north wall, the doors missing, just a gaping mouth of darkness. I stepped inside to check for mold. That's when I heard it. Not a sound from outside, but a change in the acoustic pressure of the room. I tapped the back wall of the closet with my knuckle. Thud. Thud. Solid plaster over lath. I moved 2 feet to the right and tapped again. Thud. Thud. Still solid. I moved to the far corner, where the shadows were deepest, and tapped a third time. Kung. The sound was different. Higher pitch. Hollow. Resonant. It wasn't the dull, absorptive thud of plaster against brick. It was the sound of air trapped behind a thin veneer. I tapped again, tracing the perimeter of the sound. It was a rectangle, roughly 3 feet wide by 6 feet high. A doorway. Someone had drywalled over a doorway, but they hadn't done it well. They had been in a rush. I didn't feel excitement. I felt a cold, forensic curiosity. In this market, in the Hamptons, hidden spaces usually meant copper wiring I could strip and sell, or asbestos I would have to mitigate. I reached into my back pocket and pulled out the box cutter. The blade extended with a sharp, mechanical snick. I pressed the tip against the seam I had located by sound. The wallpaper sliced open with a satisfying zipper noise. I pushed the blade deeper, hunting for the gap between the sheets of drywall. The dust that puffed out wasn't grey like the rest of the house. It was white, chalky, and dry. I carved a viewing port, a square about the size of my fist, and levered the piece of drywall out. Cool air rushed out to meet me. It didn't smell like dead rats. It didn't smell like rot. It smelled preserved. I put my eye to the hole. Darkness. Absolute, heavy darkness. But the acoustics were undeniable. There was a room back there, and for the first time in 6 months, I forgot about the orange notice in my notebook. I just needed to know what was on the other side. The smell hit me before the light did. As I widened the hole enough to squeeze my shoulders through, the air that escaped the vault washed over my face. It stopped me cold. I expected the damp, earthy stink of a basement, or the ammonia tang of vermin. Instead, I smelled roses and jasmine. It was heavy, cloying, and unmistakably expensive. It was the smell of Chanel No. 5 that had gone stale, turning slightly vinegary after decades in the dark, but retaining its core identity. It was the scent of a woman, preserved in a vacuum. I clicked on my heavy-duty maglite. The beam cut through the darkness like an object, a white spear in the black void. I stepped through the ruined drywall, and my boots landed on something hard. Not concrete. Tile. Cold. Smooth. Checkerboard tile. I swept the light around. It wasn't a crawl space. It was a finished room, perhaps 12 by 12, windowless and silent. The dust here wasn't the chaotic debris of the house above. It was a uniform, grey velvet blanket that had settled over everything for 60 years without disturbance. My light caught a sparkle in the corner. I moved the beam and froze. Standing in the corner was a dress form, and draped over it was a gown that defied the gloom. It was nude-coloured silk, covered in thousands of tiny rhinestones that flared under my flashlight like a sudden galaxy. It looked fluid, like liquid mercury caught mid-spill. I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat. I knew this dress. Every photographer knew this dress. It was the illusion of nakedness, the architecture of scandal. To the left, a vanity table sat waiting. A silver hairbrush, black with tarnish. A bottle of pills, the label faded to illegibility. A pair of white gloves, dropped casually, as if the wearer had just stepped out for a cigarette. I felt a sudden, sharp wave of intrusion. This wasn't just storage. This was a scene. It felt interrupted. The air was pressurized with the weight of someone having just left. I wasn't a scavenger anymore. I was a trespasser walking through a tomb that hadn't been sealed by a priest, but by a panic. I moved to the vanity. My hand hovered over the objects, afraid to break the spell of the dust. There was a crystal champagne coupe sitting near the edge of the table. It was empty. Of course, the liquid evaporated half a century ago. But on the rim, clear as a warning flare, was a crescent of red. Lipstick. It was a deep, blue-based red. The wax had hardened, preserving the exact ridges of the lips that had pressed against it. I touched the glass, just below the stain. It was cold. That mark was the only colour in the entire grey room. It was violent and alive. I realised then that I wasn't looking at generic vintage props. I was looking at her. The woman who died. The woman who was erased. The connection was tactile, an electric shock travelling from the glass to my fingertips. The history books said she died alone in a messy bedroom. The glass said she had a secret. I turned the light to the far wall. Sitting on a metal shelving unit, looking like a piece of industrial military equipment, was a reel-to-reel tape recorder. It was a massive, boxy thing, the reels loaded with dark brown tape. It looked heavy, mechanical, and serious. It didn't belong with the dresses and the perfume. It looked like a weapon. It was the sleeping monster of the room. The dress was the glamour. The lipstick was the tragedy. But this machine was the reason the room existed. I knew it with the same instinct that told me how to frame a shot. Someone hadn't built a secret wall to hide a dress. They built it to hide this. I reached out and touched the play button, not pressing it, just feeling the resistance of the spring. The silence in the room deepened, pressing against my eardrums. Upstairs, Zoe was eating pretzels and watching cartoons. Down here, I was standing in a crime scene that the world had forgotten to solve. I hauled the reel-to-reel machine up the narrow spiral stairs, one step at a time. It was a beast of a device, a solid block of steel and bakelite that weighed at least 40 pounds. It was the kind of over-engineered technology, built before planned obsolescence became a business model. My arms burned, the muscles trembling with a fatigue that felt distinct from exhaustion of the move. This was the weight of history. The dust from the vault clung to my skin, a fine, grey powder that smelled faintly of ozone and dead flowers. Zoe was still asleep in the master bedroom, curled into a tight ball on the air mattress I'd inflated earlier. The house around us was a shell, silent, save for the coastal wind rattling the single-pane windows in their rotted frames. I set the machine on the dining table, the only piece of furniture that had come with the house, pushing aside my box of ramen and the eviction notice I'd used as a coaster. I plugged it into the wall socket I'd tested with my phone charger. It held. The machine hummed to life, a low, warm vibration that I felt through the table wood. I threaded the dark brown magnetic tape through the guides, my fingers fumbling slightly. I wasn't a historian. I was a photographer. I dealt in light and frozen moments, not linear time. But as the tape hissed against the playback head, I knew I was about to hear something that hadn't been meant for ears like mine. I didn't have speakers, so I plugged in my cheap earbuds using a 1/4-inch adapter I'd found in the bottom of my camera bag. I pressed play. The mechanical clunk of the button engaging was loud in the empty room. Static filled my ears, the white noise of 60 years ago. Then, a rustle of fabric, the clink of glass on glass. And finally, a voice, "Jack, you can't keep doing this." It was her. Unmistakable. Breathless. Yes, but not the airy, vacant breathlessness of the movies. This was sharp, edged with a panic that felt immediate and raw. "Marilyn Monroe, Norma." "Stop," a man's voice replied. It wasn't the president. The accent was similar, Boston aristocracy, but harder, meaner, lacking the charismatic lilt. It sounded like, "Bobby, we're discussing national security, not your career." "I'm not talking about my career," the audio peaked, distorting into a harsh crackle. "I'm talking about the missiles. You told me they were gone." "You lied." "I wrote it down. Bobby, I wrote down what you said about the launch sites." My blood ran cold. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. This wasn't a love affair. This wasn't gossip column fodder. This was a woman leveraging nuclear secrets against the Attorney General of the United States. The tape captured the sound of heavy footsteps pacing on a hardwood floor, perhaps the very floor I was standing on. "If that notebook leaves this room," the man said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register, "you won't have to worry about the studio anymore. You won't have to worry about anything. Do you understand me, Norma?" You are a liability. It was a death threat. Clear, concise, and recorded on August 4th, 1962. The day before she died. I sat frozen, the plastic earbuds pressing painfully into my ears. I looked at the spinning reels, realizing this machine wasn't just a recorder, it was the black box of a crash that had killed an icon. I had the motive. I had the voices. I had the smoking gun that conspiracy theorists had been hunting for 60 years, sitting on a dining table in a foreclosed house. A flash of light cut across the far wall, shattering my trance. I jerked my head up. Outside, through the grime-streaked window, twin beams of light swept across the overgrown lawn. A car was turning into the long driveway. It wasn't a delivery truck. It wasn't a neighbor coming to welcome us. It was a black sedan, sleek and modern, moving with the silence of an electric engine. It stopped just beyond the gateposts, the engine cutting out instantly. No one got out. It just sat there, a black void against the night, watching. They knew. The silence in the house stretched tight, vibrating with a frequency that set my teeth on edge. I stared at the black sedan, willing it to leave, willing it to be a lost Uber driver, or a teenager looking for a dark spot to park. It didn't move. The tinted windows were opaque slabs of obsidian. Then, a sound shattered the quiet, a shrill, mechanical ring. It was the landline. The rotary phone mounted on the kitchen wall, a relic of the house's original build that I hadn't even realized was connected. Apparently still live on some forgotten copper line. It screamed again. Ring. The sound was violent, an intrusion that felt physical. Who calls a landline in an abandoned house at 11 p.m.? I walked toward it, my boots silent on the linoleum. I picked up the receiver, the plastic feeling heavy and cold, smelling of old dust. "Hello, Miss." "Sterling," a voice said. It wasn't the voice from the tape. It was smoother, polished, like expensive whiskey poured over ice. But the cadence was the same. The arrogance was identical. "I apologize for the late hour. My name is Richard Blackwood." "How do you know my name?" I asked, my grip tightening on the cord until my knuckles turned white. "I know a great deal about you, Wren. I know you purchased the property this morning at the county auction. I know you're currently unemployed, and that your bank account is overdrawn by $42. And I know your daughter, Zoe, is enrolled at East Hampton Elementary, 2nd grade, Mrs. Gable's class." The air left my lungs as if I'd been punched in the gut. He wasn't just threatening me. He was targeting her. He was drawing a circle around my life and showing me he could step inside it. "What do you want?" I whispered, glancing toward the bedroom where Zoe slept, praying she wouldn't wake up. "I want to make you a generous offer," Blackwood said, his tone conversational. As if we were discussing the weather. "I represent a trust that has a historical interest in that property. We are prepared to buy it back from you for double what you paid. $22,000. Cash. Tonight and the contents?" I asked, looking back at the reel-to-reel machine spinning slowly on the table. "The house is to be sold as is," he replied, "including any old junk you might have found. It's trash. Wren, let us haul it away for you." "It's not trash," I said, my voice shaking but hardening into something brittle and sharp. "It's evidence." There was a pause on the line, a silence so deep I could hear the digital hiss of the connection, the vast distance between his world of power and my world of survival. "Ms. Sterling," Blackwood said, dropping the veneer of politeness entirely, "you are a woman with $11,000 of debt and a child to feed. Do not mistake a winning lottery ticket for a weapon. If you try to use what you found, it will destroy you. Take the money. Leave the keys under the mat. Walk away while you still have legs to walk with. I looked out the window. The black sedan was still there. A stationary shark. I looked at the tape machine. I thought about the woman on the recording, begging to be believed, to be seen as more than a problem to be solved. I was poor. I was tired. But I wasn't Marilyn. I wasn't going to die with a phone in my hand, waiting for someone to answer. No, I said. Excuse me, I said no. I'm not selling. Not the house. Not the tape. And if I see that car again, I'm calling the press, not the police. That is a very unfortunate decision, Blackwood said. We will have to escalate. The line went dead. No click. Just absolute silence. I hung up the phone. My hands were trembling violently now, a physical reaction to the adrenaline dumping into my system. I had declared war on a man who knew where my daughter went to school. I locked the front door. I locked the back door. I dragged a heavy oak chair under the handle of the kitchen door. It was a futile gesture. I knew. If they wanted to come in, a chair wouldn't stop them. But I needed to do something. I needed to prepare. I moved with the precision of a medic in a field hospital. I cleared the dining table, pushing aside the heavy reel-to-reel machine, just enough to make space for my gear. I didn't have a gun, but I had my tools. My laptop, a battered MacBook Pro that had survived 3 years of freelance gigs, was my command center. I pulled out my cable kit, XLR to 3.5mm, a USB audio interface, a tangle of wires I usually used for recording wedding toasts. I needed to digitize the tape. As long as it was a fragile strip of magnetic ribbon, it was vulnerable. Fire could destroy it. A magnet could erase it. Blackwood could simply take it. But if I turned it into zeros and ones, if I put it on a server in a data center in Virginia, it became immortal. I connected the headphone jack of the reel-to-reel to the input of my interface. I launched my audio software. I hit record on the computer, then play on the tape machine. The waveforms appeared on the screen, green jagged peaks representing the voices of the dead, scrolling from left to right. Mama! I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. Zoe was standing in the doorway, rubbing her eyes, clutching her stuffed rabbit by one ear. She looked tiny and confused in the oversized t-shirt she wore as pajamas. Go back to bed. Baby, I said, my voice too sharp, too loud. I need water, she mumbled, stepping into the room. Her foot caught on the power cord of the reel-to-reel, which was stretched taut across the floor. Zoe. Stop, I lunged. The heavy machine teetered on the edge of the table. The cord pulled tight. I caught the corner of the recorder just as it tipped, the metal casing slamming into my palm. Pain shot up my arm, a dull throb, but I held it. The reels kept spinning. The green waves on the screen didn't flatline. I'm sorry, Zoe cried, shrinking back, eyes wide. It's okay, I breathed, righting the machine and checking the connection. It's okay. Just sit there. Don't move. I turned back to the screen. The recording was finished. I stopped the tape. I hit export. File name, 1962 _ evidence.mp3. Now, the upload. I tethered my laptop to my phone's hotspot. The signal in the Hamptons backwoods was garbage. 1 bar of LTE flickering in and out. I dragged the file to my cloud drive. Uploading. 10%. I watched the blue bar creep forward. Outside, the wind picked up, howling around the eaves like a living thing trying to get in. 25%. I checked the window. The sedan was still there. Were they waiting for orders? Or were they waiting for me to fall asleep? 45%. Come on, I whispered, tapping the table. Come on, 50%. The bar stopped. The spinning wheel froze. I tapped the phone screen. No service. No, I hissed. No, no, no. Then the room went black. Not just the screen, the overhead light. The fridge hum in the kitchen died. The darkness was absolute and sudden. It wasn't a blown fuse. The silence was too heavy. It was a grid cut. I looked at my phone. The signal bars were gone. Instead, a small icon appeared in the corner, SOS only. They hadn't just cut the power. They were jamming the signal. They had built a cage, and now they were closing the door. Mama, Zoe whimpered in the dark. Stay still, I whispered, reaching into my pocket for the box cutter. I'm right here. The first thing I noticed wasn't the dark. It was the sound cutting off. The house had been full of low noise a second earlier. The click of the keys, the faint hiss of the tape, the fridge wheezing in the kitchen. When the power went, all of it vanished in one clean slice. The only sound left was the blood in my ears and the dying whir of the external drive spinning down. For a breath I stayed exactly where I was, fingers still on the laptop. The screen went black in front of me, turning into a rectangle of dead glass that showed me my own face. Behind it, the closet door was just a darker shade of black. Mum, Zoe's voice floated down the hall. Small and thin. I'm here, I said. My voice sounded wrong without the house to carry it. Stay in your room. Don't move. I reached for my phone. The screen lit my hand in cold blue, then refused to show me anything I wanted. No Wi-Fi icon. No bars. The word that mattered most glared at me in the corner. SOS only. They hadn't just flipped a breaker. They'd pinched the signal off at the throat. Outside, the gravel spoke. One footstep, then another. Slow, too measured to be a neighbor. The sound came up through the floorboards from the front of the house. I held my breath and counted. 3 steps. 4. Then nothing. Fear came on like a wave and then broke into pieces I could use. I slid the phone into my back pocket, turned the brightness down until the screen barely glowed, and stood up carefully, keeping one hand on the desk. The house rearranged itself around me as a map of edges and distances I had already walked. 3 steps to the doorway, 2 to the hall wall, 5 to the top of the stairs. I moved by those counts, not by sight. The wood was cool under my bare feet. Every creak sounded like I was announcing myself. I made myself slow down instead of rushing. Fast people trip. Tripping people die. At Zoe's door I stopped long enough to open it a crack. Her room was a faint shape in the phone's dim spill. The narrow bed. The stuffed bear in the corner. The poster half peeling from the wall. Are we okay? She whispered. We're fine, I said. It's just the power. I need you to do our storm drill. Remember, we had never had a storm drill, but I needed her to hear preparation. Not panic closet, she asked. Closet, I confirmed. Take your earbuds. Stay there until I come back. If you hear anything weird, you do not come out. There's no bars, she said. Then you stay put double, I answered. Count songs in your head. I waited until I heard the slide of hangers, the soft thump of her closet door pulling shut. One problem contained in plywood and clothes. The gravel spoke again. Shorter steps this time, closer to the porch. Whoever was out there still wasn't in a hurry. They wanted me to know they were there. The old house had never felt so hollow. Every doorway was a mouth someone could walk through. Every window was a missing piece of wall. I moved down the stairs with my hand on the banister, testing each tread before I put weight on it. No lights meant no silhouette in the glass for them to pick off from the yard. No lights meant I had the same eyes as they did. At the front door, I paused and listened. The footsteps had stopped. The night outside the wood was a dense, blank pressure. Crickets had gone silent. Even the ocean was just a low, distant breath. The deadbolt was already turned. I checked it by touch anyway, then slid the chain on and felt the cheap hardware give a little before it caught. It wouldn't stop a determined shoulder, but it would slow one down. Kitchen next. The back door had a warped frame that never closed right. In the dark, I found the lock and pushed the door until the seal bit, then nudged a chair under the knob. Old habit from apartments that never had decent locks. The window over the sink showed me nothing but a darker patch of dark. Somewhere beyond it, the sedan was probably sitting with its lights off. Men inside, talking about the woman with the tape. I made myself not look for them. Room by room, I walked the perimeter, using fingers instead of eyes, sliding windows down, throwing latches, checking if any screen moved more than it should. The house smelled different with the power dead, less freon and hot dust, more damp wood and the faint tang of my own sweat. By the time I finished the circuit, my breathing had gone back to normal. The fear was still there, but it had reduced to something with edges I could work around. They didn't kick the door in. They didn't shout. They didn't call again. They just let the dark sit on the house while I stood in the middle of it, counting distances and blocks, understanding exactly what kind of game they wanted to play. They weren't here to rush me. Not yet. They were here to wait me out. The silence held through the walls, thick and patient. I stood in the middle of the kitchen and listened to it, counting my breaths until the rhythm stopped feeling like panic and started feeling like a metronome. If they were going to come in hard, they would have done it already. They had cut the power and the signal and stayed outside. They wanted the house to do the work for them, to shrink around us until I opened a door out of my own fear. They didn't know the house was already mine. I pictured the layout in my head, the line of the hall, the rotten spine of the staircase, the sagging roof, the crawl of the basement. The realtor's voice surfaced. There's a little Honda generator down there somewhere. Used to be a storm backup. She had said it like trivia. I heard it now like a contingency plan. Power cut was their move. Backup would be mine. I went up the stairs again. Light from the phone cupped low in my palm. At Zoe's door I leaned in. Still okay? I asked. Closet level 4, she said. I did 20 songs. Her voice was steady. That helped more than I would admit. I'm going downstairs, I said. If you hear anything that sounds like feet in the house, and it's not me calling your name, you don't come out. You go out the window and to the neighbors. We never talked about that, she said. We're talking about it now, I said. You climb down the porch roof. You run. You don't look back. There was a pause. What about you? She asked. I'll be busy making sure there's something to run from, I said. She didn't like it, but she didn't argue. The hangers rattled once as she shifted, then went still. In the front hall, I opened the door to the basement stairs. Damp cement and a faint chemical tang breathed up. I remembered the generator shoved behind boxes, coated in dust like everything else. Nobody had bothered to move. The steps complained as I went down. I counted them, hand on the rough wall, until my feet found concrete. The phone's light carved a cone through the dark, catching paint cans. A rusted bike frame, the sagging underbelly of the house. The Honda sat where I remembered, red casing dulled to brown, a plastic gas can slumped beside it. Extension cords trailed away into shadow. Hi, I told it. because talking to machines was easier than talking to men with sedans. You still feel like working. The gas can was light when I lifted it. A dry slosh. Not enough. I twisted the cap and sniffed. The fuel that remained had the sour note of age, but it was fuel. The generator's tank told the same story, a thin film at the bottom, not the half tank I wanted. The car held the rest. I killed the phone light and stood for a second in the dark, then went back up. At the kitchen door I listened. The gravel was quiet. No voices. No engines. I slipped out the back, keeping the door almost closed behind me. The yard was a smear of darker shapes, the outline of the car, the line of hedges, the suggestion of the other vehicle farther down the drive. My car ticked as metal cooled. I crouched by the tank with a gas can and a length of hose I'd taken from the basement. Siphoning was an old, ugly skill from foster homes that never had enough. Muscle memory did most of the work. Suck. Tilt. Wait. Gasoline hit the can with a glugging rush and the smell knifed up into my sinuses. Sharp and oily. In the distance, the other car stayed quiet. If they saw me, they were willing to watch me arm myself. Good. Let them think I was just trying to keep the lights on. Back inside, I poured the gas into the generator's tank, careful not to spill. My hands shook once, then steadied. I checked the oil, pulled the cap on the spark plug, scraped corrosion off with my thumbnail until metal showed. The manual was gone, but small engines all spoke the same language. Choke on. Fuel on. Pull. The first yank did nothing but send pain through my shoulder. The second coughed once and died. On the third pull the engine gave a reluctant rumble, then caught. The basement filled with a low, constant growl that settled into the floor and climbed my bones. Sound came back to the house. Not the friendly hum it had before, but something rougher, steadier. Power ripped a path into the dark. Somewhere above me the fridge woke with a clunk. Light blinked on along the stairwell. I let the generator run for a minute before plugging in the main extension, listening for anything that sounded like failure. The little machine held its own. They cut my power, I said under my breath. The voice lost in the engine's drone. I make my own. When I went back upstairs, the house had edges again. Nothing was bright. The bulbs flickered under the limited load, but the dark had retreated to corners. The tape deck waited where I had left it. The laptop screen came back, waking with a blink that made my eyes water. The upload bar still sat at 50%. A flat block of color. Outside, beyond the windows, the night stayed black. The sedan didn't flash its lights, didn't move. Whoever sat inside had just learned something important too. I was not going to sit in the dark and wait. The generator made the floor vibrate under my feet, a steady buzz under the boards. It was the only thing in the house that sounded sure of itself. On the laptop, the upload bar sat frozen at 50%. A small wheel spun in the corner like it wanted credit for trying. I opened the network panel. No house router. No neighbors. Just a blank list. They hadn't only killed the power. They'd wrapped us in a pocket of quiet and expected that to be enough. Half the tape lived on the drive now. Half a confession was nothing. It could still be written off as a glitch. A hoax. A story. We were at the poor end of a rich road. Half a mile away. The glass box by the water belonged to a tech investor who didn't know our names. On the weekends he actually used the place. His Wi-Fi had lit up my phone from the bus stop. If his signal could drift all the way down to us without trying, mine could reach him on purpose. I shut the lid and went to the hall closet. Everything we owned that didn't have a category lived there. I dug until my hands found a dented metal coffee can, a roll of aluminum mesh from a failed window repair, and a coil of coaxial cable with one good connector. The thing about photography is you end up thinking in lines and paths. Light, current, data. Focus the path. Get more out of what you already have. On the laptop, an old offline article about cantennas sat in the cache. The diagrams were grainy, but the measurements were clear enough. Okay, I told the empty kitchen. Let's steal some sky. The coffee can hit the counter with a dull ring. I marked spots, drilled holes, fed the stripped cokes through, and taped the mesh around the open mouth as a reflector. The result looked like junk. It only had to be accurate, not pretty. The generator droned steadily. Somewhere outside, gravel shifted under tires. Zoe's door cracked open. "Mom," she whispered. "I'm here," I said, door closed. "I'm fixing the internet, in a blackout, especially in a blackout." "You good?" "I'm bored," she said. "Be bored and safe," I answered. "That's the job tonight," she huffed once, then shut the door. The tiny sound steadied me more than any deep breath. The windows were the obvious choice, but standing in front of glass made me a shape for the men in the car. I needed height, not exposure. The attic hatch in the hallway ceiling waited with its dusty string hanging low. They could keep the ground. I would take the air. I pulled the hatch down and unfolded the ladder. Each hinge squeaked. Dust rained onto my hair and shoulders. I slung the laptop bag across my chest, clipped the coffee can to my belt, and climbed. The attic smelled of dry wood and insulation. The roof pitched so low I had to move in a crouch along the joists. At the far end, a small gable window faced the water. A rectangle of slightly thinner, dark. I eased it open. Wind slid in, cold and salty. Across the black wedge of lawn and scrub, a few points of light marked the richer houses. The tech investor's place was a clean glow on the left. That one, I told the can. I set the laptop on a beam, plugged the Cantenna into the Wi-Fi adapter, and aimed the open mouth toward that glow. My elbows dug into the wood. The wind tried to push my aim off by inches. "Come on," I murmured. "You were loud enough when I couldn't afford you." The network list stayed empty for 3 slow breaths. My shoulders started to burn. I held the can on target anyway. Then a single name blinked into the list, as casual as if it had always been there. The same string of letters and numbers I remembered. 1 bar, then 2, then back to 1. "Got you," I said. I clicked connect. The system chewed on the old password. Then the icon flipped from searching to joined. The spinning wheel on the upload window twitched. 51%. The bar edged forward by a thin line of new color. Outside, a car door thudded shut somewhere below, a dull sound under the wind. 56. 68. 79. The generator hummed under everything like a second. Stubborn heart. My arms shook. I locked my elbows and held position. 85. 99. The bar crept the last few pixels and filled. A small check mark appeared beside the file name. Uploaded. Behind it, a chain of backups fired without fanfare. Clone to a second cloud account. Mirror to an encrypted archive. Cue a message that would go out if I ever missed a daily login. I didn't send anything yet. Tonight was only about getting the tape out of this house alive. Somewhere below, an engine idled, or maybe that was just the generator echoing through the beams. Either way, the balance had shifted. The dead man's confession wasn't trapped in my rotted walls anymore. It lived in racks and cables and lines, in places where men in cars didn't get to vote. Wind pushed at my back. The attic boards creaked. For the first time since the eviction notice, The dark felt less like a cage and more like cover. The attic wind stayed in my clothes when I climbed back down. By the time I reached the hallway, my legs had stopped shaking. The generator's vibration rose through the floor, a low, stubborn hum under the plaster. The house that had been a tomb that afternoon was a machine now. In the kitchen, the laptop still waited on the table where I'd left it. The Cantenna trailed out of the attic like a metal tail. On the screen, the upload window showed what I already knew: 100%. File size, timestamp, remote path. Alive somewhere else. Half an hour earlier, that would have been enough. Get it out. Get us out. Disappear. Then they cut the power. Then they parked and waited. Escape was for people nobody had files on. I opened the automation panel I'd half-built in the attic. The skeleton was there. Mirrored copies on a second cloud account. An encrypted archive. A queued message with no destination yet. Contingencies without teeth. The generator bird. Somewhere near the front of the house, wood creaked under weight. A hand testing the porch boards. I watched the network strength flicker but hold. 1 bar. 2. Back to 1. They were still letting me have the sky. Either they didn't understand what that meant, or they were sure it wouldn't matter. On the screen, a blank rule waited for instructions. If. Then. I set my fingers on the keys. If last _ login _ timestamp is less than now minus 24 hours. The cursor blinked. Patient. I filled in the rest. Then, send _link parenthesis. Marilyn _tape _master .enc parenthesis 2. I added addresses one by one. An investigations editor at the Times. A national security reporter at the Post. A journalist who had spent 10 years writing about women who vanished around powerful men, and the paperwork that swallowed them. The keys clicked softly under my fingers, each name a line of pressure drawn across the men in the car. I pulled their contact info from an old folder I'd kept for fantasies I used to call If I Ever Grow a Spine. Then I added one more address, almost as an afterthought. A dead drop account I controlled, mirrored to a lawyer's office in Queens. The woman there made wills for nurses and bus drivers, and people with no patience for fine print. She'd told me once, half joking, if you ever want to bury something ugly in my file room, we don't lose boxes. They could lean on editors. It was harder to bully a file cabinet. Upstairs, a door somewhere shifted and settled. Zoe, turning in her closet, or the house itself shrugging. I checked the time, then added a second condition. If geolocation _of _login not near Hamptons _house and last _login _timestamp is less than now minus 72 hours arrow, send _link parenthesis Marilyn _tape _master .enc parenthesis to all _recipients _immediately. If they moved us, if I tried to be clever and log in from some hotel room under a different name and failed, if anything in the shape of my days snapped, the code had no poetry. Just plain functions, plain logic, arm's-length sentences that would not care whether I was afraid when they ran. The first hard blow on the front door came halfway through the scheduling screen. The sound went through the house in a straight line, wood taking stress, metal complaining. I froze, hands over the keyboard, then made myself finish the form. Run check every 1 hour. Trigger after 24 hours inactivity. Repeat until manual override with physical key. The key was a long alphanumeric string. I printed it onto paper. Once, in my own handwriting, then saved a copy into an offline note and pushed it to an encrypted thumb drive. No autofill. No memory. The second blow on the door hit higher. They'd decided where the weak spot was. I saved the rule and pinged the cloud service's test function. The system sent out a dummy message with a harmless file to my own secondary account. A few seconds later, my phone buzzed in my back pocket. The notification banner slid across the dead dark lock screen. New automated delivery test. Proof of life. I killed the test script and armed the real one. Status. Active, the panel said. Next check. 23:59:32. The number ticked down to 31. 30. 29. Steady. Outside. A crack of splitting wood cut through the generator's hum. The chain on the front door screamed briefly in the dark and then went quiet. I thought, very clearly, about the cost of the thing I was building. If I kept the switch armed, my life stopped belonging to just Zoe and me. Every sleep-in, every dead phone battery, every bus delayed would be a question of whether I was about to spill the dead woman's voice all over the world. If I disarmed it, the men outside could put me in a car and make sure nobody ever found the physical tape. They could run their own script on me. The cursor waited at the bottom of the log window for a note. Description, the field prompted. I typed, if I go quiet, he burns. It wasn't elegant, but it was true. I hit enter. The interface refreshed. A small icon appeared next to the rule. A simple shield, colored green. Armed. The third hit on the front door rattled dust from the ceiling. By then, the switch was already ticking away in some server rack I would never see. The laptop sat on the coffee table. Screen dimmed, but not asleep. The automation panel open like a threat letter I hadn't mailed yet. I went back up the stairs, past the attic hatch, and down the hall to Zoe's room. The generator's hum faded here, replaced by the small sounds of a child trying very hard to be quiet, a held breath, a shift of weight on old floorboards. Hey, I said softly. Her closet door opened a crack. The slice of light from the hallway cut across her face, turning one eye into a dark coin. Is it them? She asked. It's someone who thinks we're easy, I said. We're going to prove them wrong. Are we leaving? She whispered. Not yet. I glanced down the hall, measuring time in the distance between impacts. We're staying. That's the point. She looked past me. Lights are back. Some of them, I said. Enough. The second hidden space sat behind the closet she'd been crouched in, a narrow false wall that backed onto the cavity where I'd first found the tape. When I'd pulled that panel open earlier in the day, I'd seen the potential right away. Narrow, airless, defensible. The kind of place people built when they were afraid of raids that came while the radio was still warm. Move over, I said. We pushed her hanging clothes aside. Behind the dresses and hand-me-down coats, the faint outline of the panel waited. I slid my fingers into the gap I'd carved at the edge and pulled. Wood flexed, then came away with a sigh of old dust. The space behind it was barely big enough for her to sit with her knees up. No shelves. No light. Just raw studs, faintly smelling of plaster and stale perfume. I don't like it, she said immediately. I don't either. I told her. That's why it's going to work. Her nose wrinkled. Is this about the car? She asked. The one outside. It's about people who, I think they can walk into our house and make decisions, I said. I need you somewhere they can't see you while I talk to them. Talk like grown-up talk. Or talk like yelling, she said. Closer to grown-up, I said. With some very sharp edges I helped her climb in, careful not to scrape her shins on the rough wood. Once she was settled, I handed her the phone with the brightness turned almost all the way down. Headphones, I said, no light leaking out. You keep the volume low enough that you can still hear me if I yell your name. What if I have to go to the bathroom? She asked. Hold it, I said. It's not forever. If you hear nothing for a long time, you stay. If you hear chaos, you stay. The only reason you come out is if I'm here in person telling you, or if there's a fire, she said, because drills at school had taught her something. Or if there's fire, I agreed. Then you kick this panel out and go out the window like we talked about. You run to the neighbours, and you keep running if nobody answers. Her eyes shone in the dimness. Fear, not tears. She was my kid. Promise you'll come get me, she said. I didn't like lies, so I picked something else. I promise. I've made it very expensive for them to keep me, I said. That buys us chances. She didn't understand the specifics, but she understood the word buys that had been the problem of her life. Rent, food, shoes. Time, okay, she said. I brushed her hair back from her forehead with my fingers. More habit than comfort. Then I pulled the panel almost closed, leaving a crack for air and sound that would look like nothing from the room. Listen for my voice, I said through the gap, not for theirs. The next hit, on the front door, tore something. The sound changed timbre, from deep to splintered. I slid the closet door shut, masking the hidden seam, and stepped back into the hall. On the way downstairs, I took stock of the house the way they would. The narrow choke point at the bottom of the stairs, the open line from the front door to the living room, the side door from the kitchen. The generator's noise would make it harder for them to hear where I was. It also made it harder for me to hear them. In the living room, I turned on a single lamp and placed it behind the chair I meant to use, so anyone looking in would see my silhouette but not my eyes. Old trick, from watching interrogation scenes and working under bad bosses. Light where it hurts them more than you. The laptop stayed on the coffee table, angled so that whoever came through the door would have to walk past its glow. The automation panel still showed the armed rule, the timer counting down in the corner. I didn't need them to read the words. I just needed them to see that something was running. I sat down and rested my hands on my knees, forcing my shoulders to settle. The generator thrummed through the floor. My heart followed it down into a slower beat. The front door finally gave, with a crack like a snapped limb. Air shifted through the house in a new way. The next sounds came softer, boots on old wood, careful, making as little noise as possible now that they were in. 2 sets, then 3. Weight and rhythm told me more than sight would have. 1 heavier, 1 mid-range, 1 lighter, but confident. No nervous shuffles. Professionals, not kids. They moved methodically. A sweep of the front hall. A pause by the stairs. 1 pair of boots going up, 1 hanging back, 1 moving toward the kitchen. They were clearing rooms, not calling my name, not bothering with reassurance. Good. Let them show themselves clearly. As the one upstairs creaked along the hallway above me, my body thought of Zoe in her narrow gap in the wall, and tried to stand up on its own. I made it stay seated. If I went up there now, I'd lead them right to her. The man in the kitchen opened cabinet doors and closed them again, each soft thud a line in a diagram. He would see the back door still locked from the inside, the chair still braced. He would know I hadn't tried to run that way. Eventually, all 3 sets of footsteps found their way back toward the living room. You can only search a small house for so long before the math forces you forward. The one who stepped through the doorway first wasn't the biggest. He was composed, middle height, wearing a dark coat that didn't catch on the ragged trim. He held his hands in front of him, empty, palms open in a lawyer's version of harmlessness. Behind him, a larger shape hovered in the shadowed hall. I didn't need the light to know who it was. I recognized the posture from photographs and televised hearings. The slight forward lean of a man used to entering rooms, as if the air had been prepared for him. Ms. Sterling, the one in front, said, voice calm. Security, not the boss. The man behind him stepped into the edge of the lamplight. Blackwood's eyes adjusted to the dim in a second. Mine had been living here all night. We looked at each other across my second-hand coffee table and the humming laptop. In a house that no longer belonged to either of us in the way he imagined. Rain had started by the time he stepped fully into the room. It slid through the splintered edges of the front door and brought the sea in with it. The lamp behind my chair put a faint shine on the drops clinging to Blackwood's coat. He took in the ruined frame, the soft glow of the laptop, the low hum under the floor. Me. Everything else might as well have been set dressing. Of course he was here himself. Some mistakes were too old and too sharp to outsource Ms. Life. Sterling, he said, like we were in a hearing. Not my rotted living room. You've made things complicated. His lead security guy hovered half a step in front of him. Empty hands. Loaded posture. Another man breathed in the hallway. 3 heartbeats. 3 sets of lungs. All assuming I was the weakest thing in the house. I've been poor my whole life, I said. This barely makes the top 10. His eyes went to the coffee table. The reel-to-reel sat there like an artifact. The tape resting on top. Dark loops visible through cloudy plastic. I'd taken it off the spindle when the doorframe started to scream. You have something that doesn't belong to you, he said. That's the point. Isn't it? I said. They built an entire country on things that didn't belong to them. I'm not here to debate slogans, he said. I'm here to keep an old mistake from hurting people who had nothing to do with it. Including your daughter, he said. Your daughter. Easily. Like he'd practiced it. You dug deep, I said. It's my job to know where pressure lives, he replied. You and the girl live light. That makes you very movable. Not anymore, I said. Rain ticked through the gap behind him. The generator's vibration came up through the chair legs and into my bones. This can end cleanly, he said. You hand me the reel and any copies. I make sure no one from my orbit ever darkens your door again. You get to go back to being a name on a lease and nothing more. That's your fantasy, I said, clean. Reversible. Off the books. I picked up the tape. Up close. His suit smelled of wet wool and something sharp and expensive underneath. He took the reel from me carefully, like it might crack in his hand. Is this the only copy? He asked. The only one printed on 1962, I said. The only one you can hold. The security man's gaze had drifted to the laptop. Its screen hadn't gone to sleep yet. The automation window glowed. Pale lines. On dark. An old terminal impersonated on a modern screen. If. Then. Next check. 0759. Blackwood followed his man's line of sight. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. Ms. Sterling, he said, I'm going to ask you one more time. Is that the only copy? The plastic? I said. Yes. I picked up my phone from the arm of the chair and turned it so they could see the lock screen without getting close. A banner sat there from earlier. Code 47 armed. I'm not holding that tape, I said. I'm holding me. The room went very still. Even the rain felt like it moved slower. You've set a release, he said. Explain it. You like rules, I said. Here's one. Code 47. If I don't log in by 8 a.m. tomorrow, an encrypted link to that file goes to 3 inboxes at the Times, 1 at the Post, and 1 to a lawyer who hates men like you for sport. If my phone leaves a small circle around this house and never comes back, it goes. If my name appears in a certain combination with words like custody or remand in a database, it goes. If I go quiet in any of those ways, it goes. And if you oversleep, he asked, if you slip in the shower. If a bus ignores a light, then the dead woman gets what she didn't, I said, a voice that outlives the men who tried to shut it off. The security man shifted his weight. Blackwood lifted 2 fingers without looking. The man froze. Do you really think you can live under that kind of tension? Blackwood asked. Alarm clocks and tripwires and the constant risk of drowning the world in something you claim to care about. I already live under tension, I said. Eviction notices. Shut-off warnings. Caseworkers who misplace files. At least this strain buys my kid a roof. He stared at me for a beat. Then at the armed rule on the laptop. Then at the tape in his hand. What do you want? He said. Stability. I said. This house rebuilt properly. In my name. Enough money in an account that no one can yank the floor out from under us again. No more uninvited visits. And you keep me alive and technically free as long as you plan on breathing in public. You want your past quiet. You keep your present very carefully intact. That is extortion, he said. That is a service contract. I said, you get a living firewall. I keep typing my little password every morning. The file stays where it is, sleeping in racks and cables, not on front pages. You get to win your elections without wondering which day the dead speak up. You understand I cannot sign anything that acknowledges this, he said softly. No paper. No trace. I'm not asking you to write it down, I said. Paper is what you're good at burying. This runs on habit. I log in. You don't have me disappeared. That's the deal. A board creaked upstairs. His eyes flicked toward the ceiling. You hid the child, he said. She's not part of this, I said. She is the only part of this that matters, he said, to you. Which is why your little script cares so much about where her name appears. He wasn't guessing. He'd read the lines faster than I wrote them. You've built yourself into my risk model, he said. I made myself the cost of keeping your ghosts underground, I said. Rain tapped on the broken frame. The cursor in the corner of the laptop blinked, and the timer ticked down another minute. Each one felt like a nail going in, fixing both of us to the same wall. He turned his head toward the hallway. Fix the door, he said to his men properly. Call someone who knows how to make a frame last. The security man hesitated, then pulled out his phone and stepped back, already talking in low, practical tones. Blackwood looked at the tape one last time, then set it gently on the table. One day you may decide you are tired of being a fuse, he said. If that happens before I am in the ground, I hope you remember whose house you're sitting in. If I ever disarm this, I said, you'll find out the same way as everyone else, by not seeing your name in a headline. We held each other's eyes for a heartbeat longer. 2 people who had just discovered they were now responsible for keeping the other alive. Then he turned and walked out into the wet night. Engines started. Gravel shifted. The sound shrank down the road until the only things left were the generator's rumble, the buzz of the lamp, the soft thud of my own pulse. Upstairs, wood creaked again. Zoe, waiting. I sat there with the phone warm in my hand and the armed rule glowing on the screen. And understood, finally, what waking the dead had cost me. I hadn't escaped the system. I'd wired myself into it. I wasn't prey anymore. 3 months later, the house didn't smell like rot anymore. Contractors had gutted the worst of it in 2 weeks, then put it back together in a style brochures called Coastal Modern. The walls were smooth and white. The new door frame was clean oak with hinges that whispered instead of screaming. The floor didn't hum now. The generator had been exiled to a neat little shed out back. The money arrived in pieces, from accounts with names that sounded like shell companies. Settlement, the lawyer in Queens called it. After a phone call, I never heard both sides of. The bank accepted it. The hardware store accepted it. The local electrician accepted it and started showing up on time. They all believed in anonymous generosity more easily than they would have believed in ghosts. Zoe's room had a real window now, not a warped sash. Her posters sat straight on fresh paint. The hidden panel was still there, by design, but I'd added a soft mat and a battery lantern inside. If a place is going to be a last resort, it might as well be less cruel. From the living room, the sea was framed by new glass. The black sedan had stopped parking outside after the first week. Neighbours got used to the parade of work trucks and decided I'd come into some vague luck. Every morning at 7:55, my phone chimed the same flat tone. The first week after the deal, my hand flew to it like a reflex. By month 3, it moved just as fast, but the panic had thickened into something else. Muscle memory. Ritual. I sat at the small desk by the window, opened the laptop, and watched the cursor blink in the login field. The automation dashboard sat one click away. Code 47 active. Next check. 0759. I entered my credentials. The system thought about it for a second, then rolled the timer forward another 24 hours. Somewhere far from my street, a rack of servers adjusted a line in a log that said, in effect, she's still here. Reset. Zoe asked from the kitchen, mouth full of cereal. Reset, I called back. She took the ritual better than I did. To her, it had become part of the day, like brushing teeth or packing her bag. On the mornings when she woke before the alarm, she'd pad out to the desk and climb onto the arm of my chair, watching the little green icon flash. That means they can't take the house, she'd said once. That means they'd rather not, I'd corrected. Outside, the sea was flat and bright. Expensive houses glittered up the road, somewhere beyond the curve, behind one of those panes of glass. A man who had walked through my broken door now allocated security details and talking points, with my login baked quietly into his risk calculations. On the wall, the TV muttered the news on low volume. Election coverage, endless as the tide. When they cut to him, the cameras loved him, the careful grey at his temples, the measured concern in his voice, the polished humility when he spoke about doing the work. Zoe hated politics. She wandered off to her room when his face came on. I stayed. I watched him talk about trust and transparency and protecting the vulnerable while knowing exactly which door he'd kicked in to keep from being haunted. I watched the crawl at the bottom of the screen declare him the projected winner. My phone buzzed once in my hand. A separate, smaller reminder. Secondary check-in. I thumbed the notification away. The system already knew I was logged in. It just liked to stack redundancies. On the coffee table, the tape machine sat in the same spot, cleaned but still scarred. The physical reel was gone, absorbed into whatever vaults men like him used when they wanted something to exist legally but never in daylight. The real copy lived in places neither of us had seen. Data centers, mirrored backups, encrypted archives that would wake only if I stopped. I could delete it, I said once, to the empty room, just to hear what the words felt like. I didn't touch the keys. Waking the dead has a price. You don't just open the wall and then close it again. You become part of the structure. At night, when the house is quiet and the sea sounds closer, I can feel the shape of the bargain more clearly than I feel the new drywall. I traded one kind of eviction for another. We are not going anywhere. Not for a long time. The deed has my name on it and a firewall wrapped around it. The same people who would once have called the sheriff if I missed a payment now quietly fund my groceries. On the screen, Blackwood lifted his hand to acknowledge a crowd I would never stand in. The applause washed over him in canned thunder. For a second, he looked straight into the camera, with the expression I'd seen in my ruined doorway, a flicker of calculation, the weight of all the things that must not surface. I caught my reflection in the glass around his face. A woman at a window, holding a phone like a keycard, smiling without joy. Not helpless. Not free. The cost of waking the dead turned out not to be my life, or his. It was the work. Every morning, I open the gate and let the day through. Every night, I lock it again. The dead man's cloud hums somewhere above us, heavy and invisible. He gets his silence. We get our house, and I keep my finger on the switch.